Hello friends, David Vos here. How you guys doing? Well, it's still beautiful here in Oklahoma. A little cloudier day. And I wanted to do a new series. I hope you guys are going to like this one. I think it's going to take a few videos to do this. But what I want to talk about is something that is pretty exciting, pretty interesting. We're going to be talking about Mars. We're going to be talking about Orion, about the end of the world, whether or not the world will end, whether or not something interesting. For instance, let's start here. In the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And, well, let me get that and just read it to you. I mean, I want to get it just the way the King James says it. I got so many translations in my mind that it's hard sometimes to get exact. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void." Now, that doesn't sound right, does it? Lots of people have noticed this. When I was a little boy, I read that, and I always thought, what? Why does it say God created the heavens and the earth, and then it says that everything was void? Because, that would be an interesting result. When God creates something, that it just immediately looks down at what he's created. Didn't say God began to create stuff, and it wasn't yet formed, and it was still yet void. But you see, the word void means ruined or nullified, right? At least in English. It's a little difficult to know the exact meaning in the Hebrew, but it also says it was without form. But if he formed it, how is it without form? And well, if he created it, what does it mean? Was there no form when he created it? He said he created the heavens and the earth. And so sometimes it's translated empty and void. So, I mean, you could imagine then that what it's saying is that he creates the earth and the heavens. And he looks at the earth, and it was still empty because he hadn't yet made humans and animals and plant life. Okay, that's possible. And then void may mean chaotic or some other word that we're not understanding. But, so we might do it that way. But let me show you a verse in the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah. And since I have my Bible, I'm going to try to look it up here real quick. Jeremiah chapter 4, in verse 23. I think it's in 23 or, let's see. Yeah, verse 23. It says, "I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void. And the heavens, they had no light." Now, there isn't hardly any way to get around that's talking about Genesis 1. Because it says words there, without form and void, and then it says they had no light. Well, that's what it says in Genesis. It says he said, "Let there be light." Okay. And it says, "I beheld the mountains, and indeed they trembled. And the hills moved back and forth." What? "I beheld, and indeed there was no man." Well, okay, there wouldn't have been man, would there have been? God hadn't created man. In the beginning, he created the heavens and the earth, and it was empty and it was void and all. There's no man yet. But there's mountains trembling. There's no light. Okay, I get that. But the mountains are trembling, the hills moving back and forth, and I beheld there was no man. And all the birds of heaven had fled. Verse 25. So, there were birds before this event, before the void and the empty. And there were mountains, but they were trembling. Something was going on. and all the birds had fled. And beheld I, indeed, the fruitful land was just a wilderness, and all of its cities were broken down. What? There was cities before Genesis chapter 1, verse 1? There was cities? Well, between Genesis 1 and 2. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and there was cities, and there was mountains. There must have been thousands and millions of years that went by, or something, or at least thousands. And there was mountains, and there was birds and animals, but they all fled. All the birds fled, and there wasn't any man. And the land that was fruitful and had vegetation was just a desert or a wilderness at this point. And the cities that probably took thousands of years to make and build, and it tells you that Yahweh says Yahweh says he slew the dragon that was in the sea. That's the Tiamat that was in the sea. And so it says that he split the dragon, and he calls it Rahab there, and he split it in half, and he created the heavens and the earth with it. That's very similar. It's the actual story that we get from the Sumerian tablets. So we're going to try and figure out what that story is about, because it has to do with how our world was created. And it seems that there was an existence thousands of years on this earth before this present time. And there was some sort of catastrophe and destruction. And at that time, what it appears is that there were people living on Mars. And it was ruled over by gods, or in other words, you can tell what time it was in history by looking at the heavens to see when those gods that were in the heavens in the astrological wheel, what time it was by seeing what god was in the sky. That's the god that was ruling. And then therefore their sons and their daughters were ruling over the earth, which is some of the planets. And this is what you have in astrology. You have a wheel with 12 houses. Each of the 12 houses has a male and a female god. And then there are 7 gods that rule over each house. And those are the 7 planets, including planets, meaning the planets, 5 planets that they could see with their visible eye at that time, as well as the sun and the moon, making 7. And so that is something we're going to get into, to figure out this whole cosmology, this whole, because you've got people, I don't know, like, people on George Norrie, got all kinds of theories, and people are writing books, and, Sitchin is taking people's minds completely over. They believe that they've got this understanding of all the Sumerian tablets now, and most of it's just based on Sitchin, which isn't exactly correct, because everybody's looking for this planet Nibiru, and as we've said in a video before this, Nibiru may have very well been a planet, the planet of the crossing, but it didn't always mean one planet. And there were times where, in other words, it has something to do with the horizon and the area where the planets cross. And so it has to do with the time. And, in order to understand the Bible, we're going to have to understand the Sumerian tablets. Because, for instance, our Bible in Genesis says that God looked down at men and they were evil all the time, and their hearts were always evil. And he says he regretted making them. And he said, I'm going to bring it to end, to ruin, and their days shall be 120 years. Well, that's interesting, because in the Sumerian tablets it tells us that the god's lifespan was 120 sars. That's about 432,000 years. Those who lived in heaven. See, we're not certain. I think we've got a lot of this twisted. I don't believe heaven or Anu actually lived on Nibiru, or some planet. Because, you see, it's much bigger than that. The stars are all around us. Some of the gods lived way up yonder in the north, and some lived down in the south. And this was something much more vast than just some one little planet that we call Nibiru. We've misunderstood all of this. So we've got to fully and completely understand it. Why? Because I want to understand what happened. What was this great disaster in Genesis chapter 1, which made the world to be void? So we had to start all over again. And what is this slaying of the dragon? Now, you got all these people saying, some people are saying Tiamat was the earth and the asteroid belt, because that's where we get that from Sitchin. But that's not exactly true, because Tiamat is the great ocean. So we got to understand what the great ocean is. And we've done a video already on cosmology, so that should help a little bit, just going back to that video. But we're going to go forward in the next series, determining what indeed is the great Absu, which is water, and the great Tiamat, which is another kind of water. There's the pure waters, the sweet waters, and the chaotic oceanic waters. So it does seem to have something. It's all, of course, has to do with astrology. And at the bottom of the wheel, you do have one area for the first three, from Libra down through to Sagittarius, which appears to be where Abzu is. And, or I should say, that's the bottomless pit. And sometimes it calls it, in the Bible, it calls it Egypt, because the Virgo, the sign of Virgo, is just before that starts. And that's where the virgin gives birth, and then her child goes down into Egypt, which is all of us. We're born into the world. We come into this dark night. So we're going to have to figure out what all this means. As we said, when Jesus came to the earth, he began to preach, and he was from Galilee, and that's the wheel. And the thing about it is, it says he was born in Bethlehem. Well, the word Bethlehem means the house of bread, and that is the house of Virgo. So when we start opening up all of these ancient words and figuring out what they mean and translating them correctly, what we're going to do is we're going to find out who all these gods actually are. We're going to find out that none of these gods are our God. They're not our Father. And that's why the Bible talks about worshiping the host of heaven. That's not even right. We're not supposed to do that. But our Father in heaven is the only true and living God. And he is far beyond all of this mess. But he is represented. Jesus talked about him as Anu. Anu wasn't really part of the wheel. Anu was above in heaven. And so we're going to have to figure all this out. I think once we get this figured out, it's going to help us in many ways, because when we find out what happened in the beginning, what that great calamity was, where the earth was made void, that's going to help us as we was reading there in Isaiah, this coming calamity. Because remember, a couple of places in the Bible, it says that the heavens are going to be burned up. The elements shall be intensely hot. Well, what is the elements? We said what that is at one time. The elements are the Elohim, and they are the principalities, the archons, and the gods that rule over it. That's why the Apostle Paul says you want to be under law. You know, it's a worship of angels. You know, Christ went down into hell and conquered the principalities, the archons, the lords and the thrones and the dominions. So these elementals, these are powerful forces. Today it's just come down to mean like atoms, little elementary forces. They're very powerful. The little atom is more powerful than just about anything you can imagine, right? So it kind of fits, but it all comes from the Greek. We get these words from Greek and Sumerian and Egyptian. And so, you know, modern scientists, they say, oh, well, let's name this planet Uranus after Anu, or the God of the Heavenly Father, because Jesus says, my Father is Uranus. But that's not what Jesus meant. He wasn't worshiping the planet Uranus, okay? And so, this is true of everything else that we talked about. When the god Orion rules, well, there is a particular god that rules during that age. It more or less is talking about all of us that were born in that particular time at the beginning of the wheel, at the beginning of the cycle of our incarnations. And it was like a calendar. They could look up in the sky and they could see Orion being born. And they said, okay, it's spring, new year. And they believed in that based on all of their ancestors and the histories that had gone before. This is the way the Bible was. This is the way every sacred book was written. There is this great, great truth, maybe a great mountain that was in the sky, and then that probably was taken from an actual realm where people lived in a different place. And then they came to this planet and renamed a lot of places after other places that they had been. So today, we've got a place called Eden on the earth. And we've got the Jordan River. But men have renamed these places. It's named after something in the sky. The Eridanus in Greek is a constellation in the sky. So the constellation in the sky is named that. And so therefore, and had certain connotation about their history, about their beginnings. Ancient history. It all repeats itself. So in the very beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything ended up becoming void and desolate because there was a great war, a great fight, a great battle, and this God fought with Tiamat and split him up and created the heavens out of his body and his carcass. And everything started over again. And now the same thing's all going to happen again. There's another big battle in the book of Revelation because the dragon's let loose out of his prison again. Dadgum, that little dragon. And then, Michael's got a battle with the devil again. And then at the end of the 1,000 years, he's let loose for a little season out of his prison. It's a cyclical thing, and history keeps repeating itself. But it all started somewhere in a place far, far away. That's what we want to find out about. We want to find out about whether or not Mars was ever inhabited. There's a good deal of information that says that Mars was a landing base for the Anunnaki, some ancient astronauts, and actually as well as the moon. And so I believe that there are literally certain individuals that right now, very technologically advanced people that have been ruling over us for a long, long time, that have bases on Mars and on the moon. And I believe they still do have bases on. But I do believe that something happened and Mars was destroyed. And so was the Earth at that time. But not completely. And neither was Mars completely destroyed. And this is what the Bible's talking about all throughout the Psalms and Isaiah when it says Zion shall return and shall be blossom like the rose and she'll return and the curse shall be removed, because it was this great catastrophe, almost like a nuclear weapon or something was used. And everything was desolate. Remember, Jesus said of Jerusalem, not one stone should be left upon a stone. And I'm going to tell you, there is an interesting chapter. Isaiah 34 is carrying on this theme, and it's just very perplexing. We need to get to the bottom of what this is talking about, because nobody's ever done this. When we get to the bottom of this, we're going to figure something out. Isaiah 34 says, "Come near, you nations, to hear, and indeed, you people, let the earth hear, and all that is in it, the world and all the things that come forth from it. For the indignation of the Lord is against all nations, his fury against all their armies." That doesn't sound like our Father in heaven, does it? No, I don't think so. "He has utterly destroyed them. He's given them over to the slaughter. God would do that? No, 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 no. Also, their slain shall be overthrown. Their stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. Doesn't that sound a little bit like Peter, where he says the elements, the heavens and the earth that are now reserved for fire? And all the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved. Again, the elements being intensely hot shall be dissolved. The powers, the elementals, the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved. Well, then, it talks about the heavens passing by all the time in the New Testament we talk about. Not passing away, but passing by with a hissing noise in Peter. But in Revelation, as a scroll being rolled up, and here also in Isaiah. And the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. And we've talked about this being astrology. Because the constellations go by one after another like a big calendar, like a prophecy. But what is this talking about with them being dissolved, burning? And all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, as the fruit falls from the fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Oh my goodness. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom and on the people of my curse. God doesn't curse anybody. We found that out because the brother of the Lord James says curses don't come out of the same fountain as blessings. If you have a water fountain that's producing poison water, you just don't drink it. It's poison. It doesn't produce good water sometimes and poison other. And so James is making the point that our Father in heaven only blesses and has no curses, and that we should be like our Father and only speak blessings and never curses. Jesus himself says, do not make any vow. Let your yes be yes and your no, no. That's what a curse is. A curse is saying, may you die, unless you do this or that. It's the opposite of a blessing. And God doesn't do that. He doesn't threaten anybody or curse anyone. But of course, Yahweh cursed the garden, cursed Adam and Eve, the ground, thorns and thistles that will grow. He cursed Eve to be a servant of Adam. He cursed Adam to toil the soil. He cursed the serpent to crawl on his belly. He cursed Cain. He cursed everybody. And now it says, indeed, it shall come down on Edom. Remember what the Apostle Paul says about Edom? Well, he says Hagar is in bondage with her children, Ishmael, and they are the Jerusalem that is now. And as we said, Ishmael is the same as Edom and Midian. And if you want proof of that, you have to go back to the other video. But the Bible puts them all into one. They all worshipped at Mount Seir. This is what this is talking about. The people of the curse. In other words, the Ishmaelites had 12 tribes. The 12 tribes that are on the earth now aren't the ones who became Israel. But these are the carnal child. There's the spiritual and the carnal. There's always two boys fighting. And the Jerusalem that we're living here with in this world is the carnal Jerusalem under these laws and this curse. And so the people of my curse is symbolically Edom. And according to the Apostle Paul, that is the Jerusalem that is now, or the people who call themselves the people of Judea, that are believing these laws and these, they have all these laws. If you don't do what they say, then you got to be stoned and, go to war, and the Lord teaches my hand for warfare and all this stuff. So it says, and on the people of my curse for judgment, the sword of the Lord is filled with blood, is made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of the lambs and of the goats, and with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah. Remember what we said, there's coming a time. Jesus was the lamb he died for the sins of the world, but there's coming a time when Azazel is going to be sacrificed, Antichrist. And he's going to have all the sins taken and put and transferred upon his head. The priest did that on the Day of Atonement. And then they sent the goat Azazel into the wilderness, into the darkness, into hell, to never return. And this is the sacrifice upon the people of his curse, the carnal nature, the physical world. And a great slaughter in the land of Edom. The wild oxen shall come down with them, the young bulls with the mighty bulls. You see, the world's going to go through this great destruction. And as Christians, we don't have to, because it says, there's no condemnation in us. We passed over from death to life. We have no fear. But the world refused to believe and receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. So he sends a strong delusion. And that God, this Yahweh, he stands in the temple of God and declares himself to be God with his bowls of wrath and his judgments. And for those who won't receive the grace of God, they remain under the curse. Their land shall be soaked with blood, their dust saturated with fatness. For it's the day of Yahweh's vengeance. Remember, Yahweh says, I am the God of vengeance. Vengeance is mine, saith the God Yahweh. My name is jealousy. That is my name. Stand back. Don't touch my mountain. It's on fire. The year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Its streams shall be turned into pitch, and its dust into brimstone. Wow, I would really hate to be a bunch of people today that thinks they're going to rebuild the temple and think this is great and start believing in this and put the mark of the law of God on your head or your right hand, which is what they did in the law. They wrote the law of Moses on their hand and their forehead. I would hate to be, because, Jesus, there's nothing good in the scriptures about this carnal arrangement of bringing back sacrifices and rebuilding the temple and all, bringing back judgment. Jesus said not one stone will be left upon a stone. And you see, and the reason for that is because of their sin. And so they sinned, and the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers tells us that they will have to pay 7 times for their sins, and then they'll have to pay 7 times again and again until they reach a jubilee. And then in the book of Daniel it says there'll be 70 sevens that have been determined upon thy people to finish off sin and to make an end of iniquity and to bring in the Messiah. And that came when Jesus came to the earth. And sacrifices and gift offerings ceased, but only for a period of time, because they will think to bring it back again in the latter days, because there's going to be another sacrifice, the sacrifice of Edom, or Jerusalem that is now, the year of Yahweh's recompense. And then, because the people would not receive the love of the truth, they might be saved. He comes up out of the bottomless pit, and he does this destruction. The brimstone and fire that we saw in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's coming back. And it's dust into brimstone. The streams into pitch. And the land shall become a burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night nor day. Is this the hell that the Bible talks about? Where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched? That's what it says. It says, it shall not be quenched night nor day. Well, now what's it talking about? Is this not forever? But, there is an eternal hell. We talked about that. But I think in this analogy, he's talking about Jerusalem. And we're going to find out that there may be 1,000 years. That's why in another video we talked about how Jesus is going to rule for 1,000 years, but also for the whole 12,600 years at the top of the wheel. So for 10,000 years, he's going to reign over this world. What's this 1,000 year thing? Well, that's the fulfillment where the earth must lie desolate to pay for its sins. Because Jerusalem, when it is destroyed, as Jesus says it will be, when this final catastrophe, once it's destroyed, they can't just rebuild it. Because it's got to lie desolate to pay back its Sabbaths. We'll get into that in some videos in this series, in the next video or two. And so during that time, it's this great time where it's the Festival of Tabernacles. We go into the booth. and they wave branches, and that's the great multitude that's seen in heaven. They're not on the earth during the 1,000 years. They're in heaven waving their branches. And the earth, they look down at the earth, and it's in brimstone, and it's burning, and it's eternal burnings, and the fire isn't quenched. And the wicked are wreathing and moaning down here. In other words, they're living down here in a terrible situation. Because Gog of Magog is still on the earth at the end of the 1,000 years, according to Revelation chapter 20. And in Revelation chapter 21, the new heavens and the new earth doesn't come until the end of the 1,000 years. Then New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven with the great multitude, and the 144,000 will be that new tabernacle that the great multitude will be born in. So there's a lot that we got to cover to figure all this out. But if you look here, it goes on, it says, its smoke shall ascend forever from generation to generation. No one will pass through it forever and ever. But the pelican and the porcupine shall possess it. The owl and the raven shall dwell in it. He shall stretch over it the line of confusion. Stones of emptiness, they shall call its nobles to the kingdom, but none shall be there. And all of its princes shall be nothing. The thorns that shall come up in the palaces, nettles and brambles in its fortress. This is stuff in the future. It shall be a habitation of jackals and a courtyard for ostriches. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet up with the jackals, and the wild goat shall bleat to its companion. There's Azazel, who's going to be running around in the desert for 1,000 years, howling at the moon. The night creature shall rest there. Yeah, this is going to be the home of Satan. And the arrow snake shall make her nest there, the snake, the bad snake, and hatch and gather them under their shadow. There also shall the hawks be gathered, and every one with her mate. Search from the book of the Lord and read. None of these shall fail. Not one shall lack her mate, for my mouth has commanded it, and his spirit has gathered them, and has cast a lot for them. And his hand was divided it among them with the measuring line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation they shall dwell in it. But then in verse 35, the next verse, it says, the wilderness and the waterless land shall rejoice for them. And the desert shall rejoice. What? Now it's rejoicing. Now it's the restoration. The curse is lifted. This is at the end of the 1,000 years when the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. But there's 1,000 years where it's all this destruction. This generation after generation where the fire is not quenched. The habitation of jackals, the habitation of the devil. But look at this right here. We're in this area. We were talking about this great dragon that God does battle with. Look at chapter 27 of Isaiah. It says, in that day, Yahweh, with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeting serpent. In that day, like it hasn't happened yet. Sumerian tablet says that Marduk killed Tiamat, the dragon. This is Leviathan, or the great dragon here. We can prove that that's the dragon because there's parallel scriptures. It calls him Leviathan, the twisted serpent, right here. Punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, the twisted serpent. And he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. See, that's that Tiamat who was in the sea. The Sumerian. So this is describing the evolution of our world and how it was created. How the gods created the world from the body and the carcass of Tiamat. So we've got to go back and study the Sumerian tablets to figure out what all this destruction is. And the great destruction that's coming, again, has to do with Orion, astrological signs that are passing in the heavens. And one age cometh and another age goeth. When we can find out the prophecy, find out the players, find out what all of these astrological signs mean and these gods really are, and what it means to be completely destroyed. Because is it true? Is it really true that in Genesis 1:1 the earth was void? He created it and then it was made void? And if we're going to go by what we were just reading, it was literally Exactly that. The birds fled away in all the mountains. And that very same thing, we want to know what that is, because that very same thing appears to be going to happen again. Some say, people are talking about Nibiru, saying it's all Nibiru, right? Nibiru is the Tiamat or something. No, Nibiru is not Tiamat. Nibiru is the planet of the crossing, and we want to find out what that is too, exactly. We need to know exactly what this is, because we're coming down to the end of this age, and we need to know truly what's about to happen. We got to get this straight. So anyway, we'll do that in the next video, guys. This is David Vos. I hope you guys have a great day. See you tomorrow.